you would probably be surprised by the number of Formula One drivers who don't do any fancy biohacks. They don't do any fancy supplements. What they do is they do the basics really well.
First thing I wanted to start off with was like, what is your background as far as?
Yeah. So I basically spent most of my adult life in school myself. But I have an undergraduate degree in biochemistry, then medical degree. I worked for a couple of years as a doctor in London before doing my PhD in physiology and neuroscience. And throughout that entire time, like starting undergrad through med school, I was an athlete myself. I was a rower. Then I coached rowing. During my PhD, I helped found a company where we coached athletes in all aspects of lifestyle and performance and recovery. And that was everybody from weekend warriors up to elite level athletes and world champions in various sports. Through that, I started to work in Formula One as a performance consultant, which I've been doing for the last 6 or 7 years, and I still do. So I have these kind of two main thrusts of my work. The one is the sort of formal academic work where I run a neuroscience lab, and I look at various ways to treat brain injury, including things like concussions, traumatic brain injury. And then I also work with various athletes trying to, maximize their cognitive function, cognitive performance, as well as other areas related to that, like sleep and nutrition.
But I did look into a little bit of your background as well. But as far as your associate professor of pediatrics and neuroscience.
Yes.
Like what is that, and like how is there a tie-in between?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in reality, there wasn't a tie-in for a long period of time. Like I just kind of did both because I was interested in both. I worked with athletes. I'd helped found this company. I consult with other companies and digital health companies and work with athletes. And then I had this basic neuroscience lab where we're doing animal models of brain injury and trying to develop therapies. But then sort of over time, these two bits came together, especially when I then start to think about things like concussions, which is very relevant to athletes, but also using some of that neuroscience knowledge to think about how can we optimize the function of the brain of the athlete in particular, both right now and then also long term. Like how do all these things interact? So what you see if you work across all these different spheres, or at least I think so, is that the things that are really critical for health and performance, and that includes the brain and the body, are kind of the same throughout the entire lifestyle or lifespan. We often like think about them in silos, but like the things that are important for cognitive function right now in the average person or in the athlete are also important for the person who wants to prevent dementia, are also important for like trying to optimize neurodevelopment in like a kid and make sure they end up with a healthy brain. So like those core things are always the same, and you kind of get this trajectory across the lifespan. So that's how those things kind of, in my head, that's how those things come together.
Is that something new as far as science, as far as more studies starting off the pediatric?
Yeah, there's more and more. I think people are starting to realize now, well, you have to, you only have one brain, right? And it has to last throughout all these periods of your life. So now we're thinking about like, how does the trajectory of brain health start, like while, in utero, right? Or even before then, what happens early in life, and then also then what happens later in life. So people are starting to think about that. Like if you have like what happens early in life affects then maybe say how you would respond to a concussion or something later in life, and then those things interact to change your likelihood of getting dementia later in life. But this is sort of like people are right now sort of starting to appreciate that all these things interact over decades of your life.
I mean, can you make predictions right off the bat, like from studying a child into maybe becoming a teenager, whether he's going to be elite at athletics or somewhere else where he's going to have a drive, or is that something that's just going to be kind of built in as you go?
That's a great question. And the one thing that you see again and again is that the home environment is like the most critical factor in terms of how a kid will develop. And so if you're thinking about kids becoming athletes or doing going into certain professions, then exposure to those things early in life, driving those adaptations, is probably critical. But then you also need to be in an environment that's healthy and supportive, and you've got those opportunities to experience those things and grow, and then also not be hugely stressed by other things that are happening in your life, and being able to sleep and get a nutritious diet and all that kind of stuff. But if those things are in place, and unfortunately not everybody gets that, but if those things are in place, then that at least maximizes the likelihood that you'll end up on a given trajectory.
I mean, at what point from there does maybe diet or activity start to maybe play a factor in your future performance down the road? Is it something that you should start age 4, maybe 10, 11? How does that?
Essentially, the thing that predicts like motor skills, but also very other aspects of cognitive function, is the amount of exposure that you get to things that challenge those, and that starts right at the beginning of life, essentially. So, particularly if you look at certain subsets of kids, we do a lot of work looking at babies who are born preterm, right? So they don't get the full amount of time in the uterus, and if you're born early, then you have a higher risk of other later issues, including some cognitive or motor impairments. But if you're one of those kids, but you have the opportunity to develop significant motor skills early in life, which would just be a case of being exposed to, climbing, running, sprinting, playing, that kind of stuff, then that is also associated with having better executive function, other aspects of cognitive function improve. And there's nothing that says that just because you were at risk when you were born, that you can't then do really well later in life. And there are some of these kids, even though they have a very high risk when they're born, they still end up with IQs of 150, or very significant skills in terms of athletics. So it's really providing the environment and starting that early enough to kind of challenge those skills, and then the brain is always primed and ready to adapt to then result in improved function later on.
But with that, is it ever too early then to get a child active, to get them started, whether it be training or just keeping them active?
No, it's never too early to start getting them active, I don't think. But some of this is led by the kid, right? Particularly within the first couple of years, you'll see that they are they'll kind of interact with the environment in the way that they want to. There's some, if you kind of like force them to stand early or force them to walk early, that can create some strange movement patterns. So kind of the first few years, you have to let the motor skills develop as the brain wants to. Almost, it's sort of like led by the baby, led by the developing nervous system. But then, once they're sort of up and running and walking, then getting activities and play are always going to be beneficial. I think one potential negative, particularly this is not as much in other countries, but particularly in the US, is often we try and get kids to be very competitive and very focused on a single sport very early, whereas a lot of evidence suggests that being exposed to a large range of different sports and a large range of different skills, even though they may peak later, that peak is probably going to be higher. And there are, you probably heard of like Range by David Epstein, which kind of makes that case that being exposed to a wide range of particularly sports in athletes early on then results in better development later on, or better performance in a given sport later on, because they've got that range of experience to kind of draw on.
I didn't expect to go down an entire rabbit hole on this subject, but I have one more question I do have is, if activity is very good, are video games good, bad? Do they have benefits, or do they have some drawbacks, or what is your opinion?
Yeah, that's also a fun question. I recently, a colleague of mine who's a neurologist, Josh Turkman, we wrote a paper about why challenging the brain is like the key thing to have improved brain performance. And then Joe Rogan talked about it on his show, and he was like, "This is why I play video games, because it stimulates my brain." And up to a certain point, that is true. So there is evidence that certain video games, but particularly first-person immersive video games, in like where you're navigating a 3D environment, those kind of complex 3D games seem to be associated with improved cognitive function. And they've even done that like randomized trials in adults and kids where you get people to play these games and cognitive function improves. So some of those more complex games do seem to be a stimulus for the brain that can be beneficial. However, I think if you're only playing video games and then you're not physically active and you're not sleeping well and you're not socially interacting and all that kind of stuff, if you're doing it to the detriment of these other beneficial things, then there's probably a net negative effect. But playing some video games of certain types do seem to be able to support cognitive function.
Is there a happy medium? Is there like a balance, like an X amount
Yeah.
that would work and anything over that is just detrimental?
It's difficult to put a number on it, but they have done studies where they looked at kids who do and don't play games, and the kids who did play video games had slightly better cognitive function. It wasn't like a massive effect, but those kids were playing sort of 3 or 4 hours a day. So up to that point, there certainly doesn't seem to be a negative effect. Any more than that, I think you're probably going to be not doing other things that you should be doing, like your homework and playing soccer and that kind of stuff.
I was also watching or listening a little bit of your podcast. It was Better Brain podcast.
Oh yeah, Better Brain Fitness podcast. Yeah.
And one of the tech topics I was listening to was fit versus healthy.
Yeah.
Now, is that a word that people you come across use as interchangeable? If I'm fit, I'm healthy. If I'm healthy because I'm fit, is that bit?
Yeah. In general, people consider them to be the same thing, and in the average population, people who are fitter are healthier. So then in many respects they are interchangeable, but at the kind of the pointy end of athletic performance, in elite level athletes, they're often incredibly fit, but may not be considered healthy because either the toll that the training is taking on their body, or because they've become so specialized in one particular area, right? An elite level super heavyweight powerlifter can deadlift 1,000 pounds, but make that guy go for a jog and he's going to be in a lot of trouble, and like that, that cardiovascular fitness is going to be critical for his long-term health. So I think for the average sort of health enthusiast, being fitter is associated with being healthier, and those two things are very similar. But in elite sports, you can sometimes trade off health in order to be fitter for your given sport.
How do you fight that as a consultant to F1 and to other sports?
Sometimes you don't fight that, right? So if the sport pays the bills, then maybe the athlete is interested in a conversation about the trade-offs between better fitness or performance right now versus long-term health. And if it's important to get a paycheck and you're doing whatever you can in order to succeed at that moment in time, they're willing to make that trade-off. The fitness is more important than the long-term health. Some athletes, particularly, and this is becoming more common across sports. You see it in a lot of athletes who they don't want to perform well this season. They want to perform well for the next 10 seasons, right? They want a legacy. They want an entire career. Those athletes are much more likely to then take other aspects of health into account. So if you're an endurance athlete, that doing some strength training is probably going to decrease your injury risk, or you pay better attention to other aspects of sleep and recovery and nutrition. And most elite athletes are very good at that anyway, but they may take that more seriously, particularly say in the off season, right? They're looking after themselves. They're sort of doing work in other areas that they wouldn't normally do during the season, right? Trying to build a base for longevity. And then, the next stage is after an athlete retires or they're thinking about winding down, how do you then start to work on the things that they've been neglecting for the past few years? So if they're an endurance athlete, thinking more about muscle mass and power and strength. If they're, a weightlifter or a powerlifter, thinking more about cardiovascular fitness. And then, if they're retiring in their 30s or 40s, right, they still have plenty of time to do some work in those other areas.
With that, if you're a professional athlete, you have all these different aspects. You have, like I said, an endurance runner has to now worry about weight training, has to worry about other aspects as well. Mm-hmm. How does that tie in with an everyday athlete who may want to try a little bit of endurance, may want to try a little bit of weightlifting, may want to try a little bit of everything, mm-hmm. but only has X amount of hours a day, has a family, has a job, and probably gets overwhelmed by just the thought of what should I do today?
yeah, the easiest way to deal with that, just like an elite athlete would, is to have a program. And you know, you guys are very good at putting those things out there. So it's very, you can either have a coach or you can get some of these, you know, just pretty good standardized programs. Um, and you know, the general health enthusiast will probably have something that's maybe a little bit more balanced than an elite athlete who has to focus on one particular type of performance. But you know, 2 or 3 days a week you do some kind of aerobic level fitness. Maybe one day a week you do some kind of high intensity or sprint training. 2 or 3 days a week you do some kind of resistance training or weight training, and that's it. You know, assuming that you have 3 to 5 days a week to train. Otherwise, if you have less time than that, then I generally recommend people get their sort of low level activity just by walking more. And then you can do 2 or 3 sessions in the gym a week where you do some sprints and lift some weights, and that's going to give you a good balance of all those things.
Now, is there such a thing as activity overload?
Um, yeah, this is a I won't pretend to have the answer because this is a controversial space, right? Is it that you're overtrained or you're under recovered, or is it a bit of both? When I worked in orthopedics, and we specialize. This was back when I was living and working in London. We specialized in the foot and the ankle, so we saw a lot of stress fractures in runners. And the kind of the running joke in the clinic was only amateurs get stress fractures, and that's because they think that what they need to do in order to be better is just to keep working harder, and then they just focus on more volume, but they never focus on recovery. Whereas a professional is more likely to find a balance between working hard and taking time to recover. So in general, sort of like an average athlete, regardless of what they train in, they'll often think that the lever to pull to perform better is just to do more volume, do more work. When in reality, they may get better results either by focusing more time on recovery, nutrition, sleep, or even decreasing volume and shifting focus on those things. So the major you know, whether it's overtraining or under recovery, still the answer is sometimes the answer isn't more volume, it may be more recovery, and then that then results in improved performance.
Now, is that a matter of mindset, or is that a matter of having a better team, better education, better, or I guess, better understanding of what it is what it takes to keep?
It kind of depends on what's driving you to perform, right? A lot of people, a lot of people use exercise as therapy, for want of a better word, right? So if they're dealing with some personal demons, you feel better in your head when you're working hard in the gym, right? You know, you almost welcome the pain in that scenario. So then it's very difficult to say, well, I need to do less of that and I need to spend more time, you know, recovering and relaxing and focusing on those other things. So it kind of depends on why you're training and what you're training for. But yes, if your ultimate goal really is performance, then it's around thinking about what's the best thing for me to do right now in order to improve my goal, which is performance. If you're just training to train, then that's trickier because you may be training just because you like it, and then it's much harder to change your mindset and focus on recovery rather than just working harder in the gym.
Now, what did you learn from working with F1 drivers? What is their key to, I guess, I'll say longevity, but to focus for X amount of miles?
Yeah, well, the main thing that the first thing that I learned from Formula One drivers is that you have to be really careful with what you recommend, because like the rest of us, they only have so much time, right? They are clearly professional athletes. They have a lot of stuff that's done for them, right? They don't have to worry about food because somebody else cooks that. They don't have to worry about travel because somebody else organizes that. But they're constantly working on the car. They're constantly in the media. They're constantly traveling. So they need to focus on the things that are going to have the biggest impact. And in general, that's like the rest of us as well. So they don't just do everything. You know, they very much focus on the things that have the biggest impact. And that's all the stuff that we've kind of touched on already. So good quality nutrition, a focused training program, right? Making sure they sleep properly. And even that's difficult for them sometimes. So they're normal people as well. when you're thinking about focus for a race, there's a few things that you have to take into account. So one is like, how amped up are you for the race? Like, what's your level of arousal? And arousal is really important for focus and performance, like regardless of the sport. But it's different depending on the sport. Your optimal level of arousal is different, right? It's different for archery versus sprinting. And so depending on the athlete, you may work to increase or decrease your arousal based on, you could do breath work, you could do meditation, you can use supplements like caffeine and some other things, depending on whether you need to be more or less amped up to perform optimally. And that's different for different drivers. Because if they're too amped, right, if they're not amped up enough, they're slow off the line. They have a slower reaction time. We know that. But if they're too amped up, then they're more likely to make a mistake and crash. So you kind of have to find that sweet spot. And then once you're going, the important thing is to, first of all, be as good as you can at the task that you're doing, right? So they've obviously practiced a bunch at driving, and a lot of what they're doing is automatic. They're not even thinking about it. It's all automated, and that comes from extended periods of practice. And then as things get more difficult, or their cognitive load increases, and this happens particularly as they get tired, then removing distractions is really important. So you'll notice if you watch Formula One, towards the end of the race, particularly if it's hot and they're getting stressed and tired, they'll stop talking on the radio and they'll ask the team to not talk to them anymore, because they're just going to put all their resources into focusing on the car. Whereas earlier in the race, they still feel good, or everything's still functioning. They're not tired. They can handle more things. So to kind of focus in that same way, matching or being able to regulate your distractions based on how your other cognitive load is important. You can kind of see them do that in real time. And yeah, they're the best in the world at doing that at 200 miles an hour. But sometimes, they get tired and fatigued and overheated. And then it's just about getting rid of distractions just so you can focus on the job at hand.
Now, is there something you drill with them off the track that maybe can help them, I guess, maintain that perfect mindset or for a longer period of time than you would otherwise?
Probably the biggest thing that you can do is make them as acclimated to those conditions as possible. So training them to still be able to perform when they're hot and they're fatigued. So the more that you can increase their physical fitness, right, the bigger the buffer you have. And then you can also do that with cognitive training. So there are various ways that you can have them do cognitive tasks while they're, say, doing an aerobic training session, so that their body becomes accustomed to making decisions whilst fatigued, whilst doing some kind of physical work. Because essentially the entire race, which could be a couple of hours, is like a strenuous jog the entire time, right? It's hard physical work, and you're trying to make complex decisions. So you can train that, and the more you train that, then the more buffer they have, the more sort of headroom they have to make decisions and keep their focus, particularly as they get tired.
Now, is that a sport-specific drill that only could apply to F1 drivers or race drivers, or is that something that everyone can utilize, work somehow into, whether you're a surgeon performing a long surgery, whether you're doing long hours or whatever you do? Is that something that everyone can work on?
Yeah.
Maybe in a heat environment for a surgeon, but
yeah, no, absolutely. And sort of practicing being able to do the thing that you need to do when you're under stress is probably one of the best ways to make sure that you still perform in that scenario. So I'll give you like a personal example. When I was working as a doctor, this is now more than 10 years ago, I signed up to do a 24-hour off-road Ironman race. And I knew that I was going to have to bike through the night and then do a marathon the next morning. So when I did night shifts at work, I would work all night, I'd do a night shift, and then I'd go and do my training. So I practiced training while sleep deprived. And you can do this in any of those scenarios. You can create fatigue, and then you can practice the thing that you need to be able to perform at in that scenario. So that could be, surgery whilst fatigued. You can do cognitive tasks, or it can be athletic performance. Any of those things. Practicing once you're in that stress scenario, well, then first of all, you're going to have better performance because you've practiced it, but also you're going to have the knowledge, right? You're going to remember, hey, I know I can still perform in this scenario. So then, and then because of that, you will perform better. You'll get a placebo effect just from knowing that you are capable of performing in that situation.
Now, does that have long-term effects? As far as sleep like maybe sleep deprivation, really going through fatigue as much as possible. I mean, for the short term, nailing the triathlon is great, but I mean, does it now maybe have some long-term implications, or you just
Yeah,
more saw?
I can definitely say that doing that race was not healthy. So like my body completely fell apart afterwards. So yes, there is a trade-off, particularly if you're trying to perform better in those very stressed scenarios. There's a possibility that that scenario itself is not a good one for you physiologically. But again, you know, sometimes you just have to perform in that scenario. So that's a trade-off that you're making. However, you know, doing these things once in a while, and then giving yourself adequate recovery afterwards. You know, sometimes people get overly concerned about these individual things that maybe aren't so good for us in the moment, but actually in the grand scheme of things, you'll be just fine afterwards. And maybe there's even that long lasting cognitive benefit of knowing that you can do difficult things, which I think is really important.
You mentioned stress a little bit earlier. I mean, can you use stress to your advantage when it comes to training, when it comes to just keeping yourself healthy and fit?
Yes. So basically everything that we do that drives adaptation is a stressor, right? So exercise is a stressor, fasting is a stressor. You know, people are really into like hot and cold. Those things are also stressors. I'm sure you know about the idea of hormesis, which is that this small dose of a stress then drives a physiological adaptation that results in you being stronger or fitter afterwards. So all those things are beneficial primarily because they drive a stress response. In order to benefit from that maximally, you then have to have some period of rest and recovery, right? That's when the body adapts. So then it's potentially problematic when you're constantly sleep deprived or you're overtraining, right? You're driving that stress too high. However, I think that there is some way, particularly in you know, if we're kind of thinking about the bigger picture, it's not always a bad thing, because knowing that we're capable of doing difficult things seems to be important for mental health and a whole bunch of other aspects of long-term health. So even if, you know, long periods of you know, for some period of time, say you're sleep deprived, how you respond to that mentally may be what has the biggest effect. So there are some studies where they ask people how much chronic stress they have, and then they ask them whether they think stress affects their health. And then they look at some health outcomes. So I think they maybe even looked at mortality, so how likely this person is to die. And they found that stress only increases the risk of chronic stress only increases the risk of mortality in people who think that stress negatively impacts their health. So it's that combination of the two. So if you're stressed and you spend the whole time thinking, oh my God, this stress is really bad for me, that combination results in worse health outcomes. Whereas if you think, actually, do you know what? I'm just fine. This stress isn't so bad. I'll be okay. It doesn't seem to have the same effect. So now there's a lot of work to do these metacognitive approaches where you reframe stress as something that drives growth. Like, just like we talked about earlier, stress is how you adapt. So if you know, even in people who are chronically stressed, if you can find a way to have them reframe that as not necessarily this terrible thing, they, you know, even if you don't see lots of benefit from it, because chronic stress is, you know, is stressful on the system, you may see less of an issue from it, because of the way you've reframed it. And we know that how we think about things actually drives our physiology. And so by doing that, you may even gain some benefit by again knowing that you're able to tolerate these difficult things.
No, working at the University of Washington, did you work with the Huskies at all this year, the football team?
No, sadly not. I can take no credit for that whatsoever. They had a great year, but no, I don't work with any athletes at UW currently. I just my most of my work with athletes is with Formula One right now.
But even with using the Huskies as an example, how do you manage, or how do you maintain the stress levels when, I guess, from a year-long season, when maybe the first 2 games a team plays is probably against lighter opponents, and
Mm.
as the games get more and more meaningful and the stress becomes more and more into the championship, from playoffs to championship, do you have to do more mind drills just to keep them focused, or is it same as it was in week 1?
Yeah, they'll always be right. There'll be this kind of baseline plan because you've built up some capability for performance, right? And that's going to be skill and sort of fitness specific for, say, for your position. And then usually throughout the season, what you're just working is to try and maintain that, right? You're not trying to drive further adaptation physiologically, right? Because you can't do that physical work every week during the week and then also perform well on a Saturday. So you just do small amounts to try and maintain what you can. And then the rest is going to be, there's going to be a huge mental component. So particularly, so if you talk about the Husky season, what they became really good at, and which is probably really helpful, is they knew that even if they were, losing right towards the end of the fourth quarter, or, it was really close game, they would have enough to sort of push it over the line. And they did that again and again and again. And that's that mental strength from knowing that they can do those difficult things and still turn it around, and they can keep performing deep into the fourth quarter. And there are always ways to try and drill that and try and build up some of that capacity. But in reality, the only way you're really going to know that is once you've done it, which is again why that kind of idea of exposing yourself to those challenging situations and knowing you can overcome them, that gives you that strength to know that you can keep pushing when you need to.
Now, is that something that has to be trained, or is that just comes with success and victories and better performance?
Yeah, I think anybody is capable of that, but you have to put yourself in the situation first to experience it, right? That you have to know, you have to put yourself in a situation where things are on the line, and you're pushing yourself and you still overcome. And it doesn't always work, right? So knowing that, so if you still, right, you happen to lose one of those games, you still focus on the things that you can do right. And this is something that we might see in Formula One, where you might not do well in a race, and that may or may not be your fault, right? The engine may just give up halfway around. So, right, you have to withdraw from the race, but that wasn't really your fault. So focusing on what you did right or what you could have done better, and then, sort of forgetting the things that are outside of your control and focusing on the things that you can control becomes really important. And so I think that's another aspect of that kind of prolonged performance, is not taking those, using those losses as opportunities for growth and focus on things you can improve rather than focusing on the loss itself. And that's something that I think people consistently do, but is absolutely trainable. That's part of, if it's part of a team, it's part of the whole team mentality. It's how the coach then uses those scenarios to sort of, drive adaptations, be those mental or physical. And anybody can do that. It's not an innate thing. It requires exposure to that situation and then using failures as an opportunity for growth, and directly thinking about that.
So is it easier to just dismiss a faulty engine or a blown tire or just a crash as a mistake? I'd say stuff happens, move on to the next, or does it again matter when it happened? If it was the first race of the year, okay, I got a long time to recover from this. But if it happens toward the end when there's a championship on the line, does that play a factor?
Yeah, this is always going to be a big part of, and you're right. So first race of the season, something goes wrong, you have plenty of time to catch up. Later on, it's going to be harder, but it's also going to really depend on the athlete and depend on the coach. So each athlete has a coach. I tend to work with the coach in addition to the athlete to kind of support them. And so each person responds differently to those kinds of losses and failures. So having somebody, and that's one of the nice things about Formula One, is each driver has this person who's with them through everything. They do their training, they do their food, they're with them every day. And so getting having that support from somebody who knows you really well, knows what you need either to get over a loss or what you need to think about in order to perform well in the next race. And that relationship develops over years. So it's always going to be really individual for the person, but then having somebody who can support you through that process can be really critical.
Talk about like what are some of the quote hacks that maybe people should eliminate to continue their goals?
Well, there's two most important things. So say your goals in the gym, and one is that you're providing the right, and this is the case for pretty much any type of performance, be it physical or mental, is are you challenging yourself in the right way? So are you providing the at least maybe not the best possible, but are you providing a good stimulus for your outcome? So often when people have goals in the gym, and I've certainly had this issue before, is like you want to do everything, right? You want to get leaner and you want to get bigger and you want to get stronger and you want to get faster and you want to get fitter. And that's difficult to do all at the same time. So having a focused goal is really important, and then providing the right kind of program in order to work towards that goal. And then so provide the stimulus that you want for the outcome or performance that you want. The body and the brain are the same in that respect. And then work on that consistently, right? It takes a long period of time and you sort of slowly adapt over time. And then support that process by focusing on sleep and nutrition and all these things that allow your body to adapt and get stronger. So if you line all those things up, right, you can keep getting fitter or stronger for long periods of time. But where people often get stuck is they either don't have a defined goal, or they're not doing the right kind of training to meet the goal that they have, or they're not consistently applying that stimulus, or they're not supporting recovery and adaptation properly, or some combination of all of those things.
For those of us who aren't really elite athletes, what can we learn most, I guess, from watching a program of an NFL star, an F1 superstar, and just take from them that incorporate into our programs and our regimens?
Yeah, this goes back a little bit to what we talked about before, but it is slightly different. But the main thing is being focused, like knowing what your goal is that you're working towards, right? That's one thing that elite athletes are very good at. They know I need to perform this way on this date, right? And that could be week in, week out in the NFL or in soccer or something else, or it can be in a given race in F1, or if you're an endurance athlete or a fight sport athlete, it's just you have one time, right? One race, one fight that you're working towards. So you know what you need to do and when you need to do it, and you're working purely towards that. Assuming you have that, then really focusing, like the basics are the things that always matter. So you would probably be surprised by the number of Formula One drivers who don't do any fancy biohacks. They don't do any fancy supplements. What they do is they do the basics really well. So they do sort of a good training program. And then because they're so busy doing all these other things, they make sure that they eat well, they rest and recover, they sleep well, they work really well on, because they're traveling time zones all the time. So they have jet lag plans. They know how they're going to shift their circadian rhythm over time so they can sleep really well when they get to their destination. They're really focusing on the basics rather than any of the sort of the fancy other things that you can do on top. And I think, that's something that all of us should focus on more as well. Less of the biohacks and more of just making sure we're getting the basics nailed.
Do the pros have off days? Does Max Verstappen ever come and have a bad day at the gym or a bad day working out and just throws him off completely like the rest of us? Or is every day flawless, perfect, and just regimented to every inch?
But you probably know that's a loaded question, because the answer is of course not, right? Everybody has bad days, especially the pros. There was actually there was a nice interview that came out recently with the current Olympic decathlon champion, where he basically said the same thing. He was like, the vast majority of my days in the gym were just like, they were fine. Like I showed up, I felt okay, I did the work, it was all right. I didn't feel amazing. But it's just consistently doing the work that's really important. And even when you don't feel great, getting the work done. So people like most days won't feel amazing. And then even if you have a really bad day, that's fine because there's two things that you can take from that. One is that you know that being consistent is the real important thing. So the next day you might feel great and you're back on track. But also, we spend a lot of time now in the sort of health spheres focusing on making everything optimal every time. Right? We have to sleep optimally every night. We have to train optimally every day. We have to make everything as optimal as possible. But then when things go wrong, we don't know. Like we sort of we get a bit mixed up in our heads. We're like, well, I didn't sleep as well as I needed to, so now I'm not going to perform as well. Whereas if you go in the gym and you had a bad night's sleep and you get the work done anyway, you know that you can still perform even when things are suboptimal. And that kind of, I think you can reframe it to say on a bad day, you still got the work done. And actually that means you can still do things even when everything else isn't going well. And that's actually a really good thing to know that you can perform in a suboptimal condition rather than trying to make sure that everything is the best possible thing and optimal
Really
all
quick
the time.
here. When you said that, are many people then too reliant on their wearables, on their Whoops, their Auras, and everything else? And when it's in the red, okay, I can't work out today because it just told me so. Is that an outcome that's more trendy than before?
Yes. So I think we are too reliant on that. And there's a few reasons why. So one is we don't necessarily know how good the data are. So how good even is your wearable at tracking your sleep or your recovery or your HRV? They're okay, some of them, but they're not great. But we also know that the data affects us. So there's this nice study that was done by Ellen Langer and Steve Lockley at Harvard. And what they did was they had people come into the lab to sleep. And they either had them sleep for 5 hours or 8 hours. And then they randomized them to change the clocks. So some people who slept for 5 hours thought they slept for 8 hours because on the clock on the wall, it had gone forward 8 hours, and vice versa. Some people who slept 8 hours, the clock only went forward 5 hours. So they thought they'd slept 5 hours. The thing that then the next day they looked at like reaction time and how sleepy they felt. The thing that affected their performance the next day was how long they thought they'd slept rather than how long they'd actually slept. So if you're getting poor quality data from your wearable, right, your Aura says you slept really badly last night, but actually you slept just fine. Because you think you slept badly, you will perform worse the next day. They've kind of shown that in a few different ways. So if the data aren't good quality, that's really gonna mess you up. The next thing is that particularly for things like recovery scores and this kind of stuff, we don't know, and each wearable has its own like proprietary recovery score or something. We don't know. They won't tell us what makes it up. It's kind of this made up number that they tell us is supposed to be good, and we don't know if it's good or not. And then you just because you have a low recovery score doesn't mean you can't perform well or you can't train well. What a low recovery score, so assume it comes from HRV. A low HRV says anything you do today that's strenuous will have a higher physiological cost. It doesn't mean that you can't perform well. So people often conflate the two. They think because my recovery score is low, I won't be able to work hard in the gym or I won't be able to perform well. But that's not actually what HRV says. It just says that actually if you do work hard today and you could be perfectly good, you could perform really, really well today, it just might come at a slightly higher physiological cost and you need to recover more afterwards. So we're kind of letting these wearables with not necessarily great data and not necessarily interpreting the data in the right way drive how we feel and perform, when in reality, often a lot of that we could just, you might know whether you slept well or not. And you might know, today is a day I want to work hard in the gym, and you want to go and do it and not have some wearable tell you whether you should do that or not.
So is that something you can get away with all the time, as far as maybe the recovery score isn't great today, but I'm going to train 100%, and maybe okay tomorrow, 2 days later, 3 days later, not so well? Is that something you can always get away with?
So it's probably not something you can always get away with, and there is not necessarily from wearables, but particularly from if you do your HRV with like a chest strap and you do it in the same way every day and you're very consistent in it, yeah, then if you can follow trends over time. And so say if your recovery score is going down over time, or your HRV is going down over time, then yeah, keeping on pushing it is probably not a good idea, and you'll need some time to recover. So this data can be really helpful, particularly for long-term trends. But I think trends is where it's important rather than thinking on a day-by-day basis, should I work hard today or not? I don't think I don't think they're good enough quality to do that. But if you see this really consistent decrease in recovery score over time, then that's probably a good idea that, it's time to pull back or give yourself some time to recover.
Last question I do have, and I probably way overdid it on this one, but we did say Max Verstappen does have bad days. The auto F1 drivers do have bad days, but a lot of times you'll see on social media, you'll see never quit, keep grinding, no days off. I mean, is that something when people see and look at and have it jammed down their throats and on screen all the time? Is that something that can play into their heads? Well, if they can keep doing it, I better not take today off.
Yeah, I think this kind of grind culture is and maybe this is where wearables have been helpful, is just forcing people to focus on how they're recovering, because this idea that you just like keep going, you smash yourself every day, right? The sort of the David Goggins approach, just keep going, just keep going deep, keep pushing yourself. I think particularly in the context of people who have a bunch of stuff, right? We have other stuff going on, right? We have family stuff, we have work stuff. I think that yes, it's useful to know you can do difficult things. We've already talked about that, right? Occasionally doing stuff that's really hard is great and it's important, but also allowing ourselves and giving ourselves that time to rest and recover is really critical if we want to be fitter and healthier longer term. So yes, it's important to do difficult things, regularly, but it's also really important to have dedicated rest and recovery very regularly in order to make sure we're as fit as and strong as possible long term. So there's a balance, right? Both are important, but you do have to find balance between the two. And just like going hard every day, like I said, that's how amateurs get injured, because they never give themselves the time to recover.
Who does it the best in F1?
Oh, I can't say that.
Thanks again.